So hi everyone. So today we have Cristabel Cane from UC London, and she'll talk. The title of the talk is "The Problems of Temporary Intrinsics."
Thank you. Yeah. Cheers. So yes, I'm Christabel, and I want to talk to you about relationalism. Oh, do I have a microphone? Don't worry. Okay, I want to talk to you about relationalism and the problem, or as we see, the problems of temporary intrinsics. So
You might need to click the screen.
oh, thank you. Hello. Okay, good. So relationalism is arguably the most well-known theory of four-dimensional endurance. So it's four-dimensional because it accepts that objects have temporal extension as well as three-dimensional spatial extension, and it's a form of endurantism because it proceeds from the intuition that objects are wholly present at every moment of their existence. So this theory rejects temporal parts. So we have David Lewis's established problem, which accuses relationalism of being unable to deliver temporary intrinsics. So these are a very special kind of property. They are temporary, so they are properties that change within an object's lifetime. So they're properties that an object either gains or loses or both, and they're intrinsic. And I'll get a little bit clearer on exactly what I mean by intrinsic a bit later. But for now, let's just say that they're properties that come down entirely to the way that an object itself is nothing else. So as it's currently stated, I think that the problem of temporary intrinsics assumes that the relationalist will relativize to absolute times. And I'm going to argue that this is a very bad idea because it doesn't cohere with our understanding of special relativity. Instead, I'm going to argue that the relationalist actually loses their temporary intrinsics because they have to relativize to regions of space. But I'll provide three possible solutions to my updated problem. The first will be relatively simple, and that is to identify objects with those regions of space-time. My second solution will be to bite the bullet somewhat and to try and salvage some distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic temporary properties by introducing this notion of relative intrinsic. I'm going to reject these first two solutions and focus on my third, which will be to posit intrinsically instantiated temporal passage. And I'll argue that these intrinsic times give the relationalist everything that they need in order to solve the problem of temporary intrinsics without forcing them to equivocate either on their notion of objects or their notion of intrinsics. But what is a relationalist, and why would anyone want to be one? Well, to answer this question, we'll have to consider the humble tomato. Tomatoes are delicious, they're chock full of antioxidants, and they change in this rather fabulous manner. So relationalism is first and foremost a solution to the well-established problem of change. What is this well-established problem? Well, very briefly, the tomato is green all over, and then at some later stage, it's red all over. And yet we want to say that it is one and the same tomato that persists despite these changes. But to say this is to attribute Leibniz's law, which states that for any objects A and B, they are only identical if for any property A has it, if and only if B has it. But clearly, this isn't what happens in the case of our shading tomato. Right? The early green instantiation of the tomato doesn't share all and exactly the same properties with the later red instantiation of the tomato, colour being the obvious example. Now, an intuitive response to this question says something along the lines of objects that change have these different and often incompatible properties, but they don't instantiate them at the same time. And this is a good solution, and indeed it's what many theorists of persistence avail themselves of by temporally relativizing the instantiation of temporary properties. So instead of saying that the tomato is green, we'll say that the tomato is green at T1. In relationalism, to my mind, has a particularly neat way of going about this temporal relativization. They relativise with respect to the properties themselves by positing temporary properties as relations that obtain between the object that instantiates them and the times at which they're instantiated. So instead of saying that the tomato is green, they'll say that the tomato bears the greenness relation to T1. Instead of saying that the tomato is red, they'll say that the tomato bears the redness relation to T2 or T at least time. The problem with this is that once change is understood in this way, that the problem of temporary intrinsics begins to emerge. Let me be clear, actually. The problem of change and the problem of temporary intrinsics are separate. They're sometimes conflated in the literature, but it's only once change is understood in the way that the relationalist posits that the problem of temporary intrinsics rears its ugly head. And the problem is just this. All of an object's temporary properties must be extrinsic on the relationalist's model. That's because they no longer come down entirely to the way the changing object is. These times come into the picture. So the greenness of the tomato is no longer down entirely to the way that the tomato is, because we've got to make reference to T1. Now, at this point, I'd like to address an elephant in the room. And that's that I'm aware I've chosen a really controversial example in colour. I mainly picked it because I wanted to have fun slides. But there's a very plausible argument that says that colour is necessarily extrinsic because it depends on an external observer. So let me be clear, when I talk about colour or temperature or height, whatever example I use, I'm talking about the features of an object in virtue of which it's judged to be such and such a colour, height, temperature, whatever. However, if you find the colour example too offensive to countenance, please use to switch it out for your own paradigmatic intrinsic property. Whatever I have to say will almost certainly pick too. But what is an intrinsic property, paradigmatic or otherwise? Well, I've got a couple of naive views on the slide here. The first is down to Darwin Kim, and he says that an intrinsic property is compatible with loneliness. And I've also got one that Stephen Yamlo discusses. I don't think he endorses it, but he discusses it, which states that intrinsic properties are stable under variation in the outside world. Some examples might be illustrative. So I've got my beautiful fruit bowl in front of me. Let's consider my melon. Now, my melon has lots of properties, one of which is that it's spherical in shape, or near enough spherical. Now, this sphericalness is compatible with loneliness, because if my melon was all alone in the universe, it would plausibly still be spherical. Similarly, I can't change the spherical shape of the melon without changing the melon itself, so this property is stable under variation in the outside world. So for these reasons, my melon's spherical shape is an intrinsic property of it. But it has lots of extrinsic properties as well, one of which being that it is larger than my apple. Now, if my melon was all alone in the universe, there would be no apple to compare it to, so this property isn't compatible with loneliness. And similarly, there are lots of things that I could do to the apple to make this property fail to obtain. So I could inject it with growth hormones or saline solution, make it much larger than my melon. So it's not stable under variation in the outside world. So my melon's being larger than my apple, these reasons, has got to be an extrinsic property of the melon. Now, I'm aware that there are problems with both of these views, the most salient of which have been pointed out by Ray Langton and David Lewis, who quite rightly say that loneliness is compatible with loneliness, and yet loneliness isn't stable under variation in the outside world. I can change whether an object is lonely or accompanied by adding or subtracting the objects to the region of space-time that surrounds the object. So they're not compatible with each other, these two definitions, and one, and I suspect probably both, aren't entirely watertight. However, I do think that kind of considering them gets us kind of closer to understanding what is at stake when we discuss the problem of temporary intrinsics. So it is beyond the scope of this talk to give a full-throated definition of the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic properties. But for now, I will say that I'm highly sympathetic to Ralph Bader's view. He says that intrinsic properties are the fundamental properties or properties that are solely grounded in fundamental properties and or fundamental relations holding amongst the proper and improper parts of the object that instantiates the properties. And the reason that I like this so much is because it means that the relationalist isn't automatically counted out from the task of supplying a metaphysics that delivers these temporary intrinsics, just because the intrinsics will be understood to be relations. And that makes sense, right? Because I have lots of properties that are both intrinsic and relations, right? So I have a shorter left thumb than my left leg. This is a relation that obtains between two of my possible parts. So the property of having a shorter left thumb than my left leg is an intrinsic property of mine. We don't need to make reference to anything external to me in order to make sense of it. But this is not analogous to what is going on in the case of the temporary properties as the relationalist currently understands. These relations between the object, the whole object, so its improper parts, and these times which are independent of and external to the changing object. Well, it's actually this conception of times that I'd like to challenge, because I think that the problem of temporary intrinsics, as it's currently stated, seems to assume that properties will be relativized to absolute times. And this makes the problem, I think, appear worse than it actually is. And that's because absolute times are completely independent of and external to the objects that persist through them. So absolute times are vestigial of Newtonian space and time. Very quickly, they rest on the assumption that there is this privileged ordering of instants, which you'll see I've represented diagrammatically as simultaneity slides on the slide. And this privileged ordering implies that if we have two ideal clocks and we synchronize them, then they will stay synchronized no matter their relative motion. But we know that this assumption of absolute time is unwarranted, and this is demonstrated by cases of relative motion, like the inaptly named twin paradox. So I'll give you a version of this now. We have two twins, one of whom stays on Earth, and the other of whom travels very far away from the Earth, high speed, constant speed of light, and then travel back again. Well, when the travelling twin returns, they will have experienced less time to have passed than the twin who stays on Earth. And I think that this shows us that the relationalist must relativize to the amount of time that each twin themselves has experienced as passing. Otherwise, we're liable to commit ourselves to talking all sorts of nonsense. And I'll give you a version or an example of this nonsense now. And because the twin paradox discusses aging, I will discuss the property of wrinkliness. So I know this isn't really how wrinkles work, but let's say that both twins have genes such that they will only get their first wrinkle at exactly 40 years old. Well, according to the earthbound twin, the travelling twin gets her first wrinkles late because according to the earthbound twin watch, more than 40 years have passed since the time and place of their births, and yet the travelling twin is unwrinkled. Whereas according to the travelling twin, the earthbound twin gets her first wrinkles early, because according to the travelling twin watch, less than 40 years have passed since the time and the place of their births, and yet the earthbound twin is all wrinkly. But we know that this apparent discrepancy is illusory. It's not that the twins are aging at different rates, it's just that more time has passed for one twin than the other. And I think that this shows us that it's just really important to temporally relativize the amount of time that the object itself measures to have passed, unless it's doing what it's doing. So in a word, we should relativize to proper times. So in the absence of absolute times, we do use these proper times, which is exactly this, the amount of time that an object measures passing along its world line, or the set of spatio-temporal points it occupies as it travels through space-time. And that gives us the results that we want in cases of relative motion, like the twin paradox, which is to say that both twins are aging at the same rate relative to their proper times. So, for example, each twin will have the property of having their first wrinkle relativized to each twin's 40 years of proper time. So this suggests a new metric for relativizing temporary properties. So we already have metric A, which is how the relationalist is assumed to do it. But I want to put forward metric B, which is how I think they should do it. So I want us to consider, again, a tomato that ripens over the course of a working week. Metric A will relativize to absolute times, which is to say to external locations that are entirely independent of the tomato. And as I've kind of already indicated, when we relativize the greenness of the tomato to Monday, we must understand that greenness as extrinsic to the tomato, and its extrinsic properties. And I think that we can get an intuitive hold on this, because Monday would have existed even if the tomato hadn't. Instead, I want us to use what I want relationalists to use, metric B, which relativizes to proper times, and specifically to the amount of time that has passed since the object came into existence. So, maybe this is a bit arbitrary, but I've chosen the starting point for our tomato to be the time at which it was picked, which is to say the time it became an individual object. And let's say that the tomato is still green on the 4th day since it was picked, but it begins to ripen on day 5, all the way through to the juicy red tomato. And as I see it, there are two main benefits of relativizing to metric B. So, as we've already seen, the relationalist is independently motivated to relativize to metric B because it gives us the results that we want in situations involving relative motion, like the twin scenario. We wouldn't want it to look like two tomatoes are ripening at different rates just because there is relative motion. Of course, it may turn out that two tomatoes are ripening at different rates, but we would want to correct for their relative motion, if indeed they are a relative motion, by relativizing their temporary properties to their proper times. But what I want to point out is that relativizing to metric B comes with a nice side benefit for the relationalist. And that's because the times given by metric B aren't entirely independent of the objects that instantiate the relativized property. And this is for two reasons. So the first reason is that we can't even make sense of the temporal metric, the nth day since the tomato was picked, without making reference to the tomato. And more generally, we can't make sense of the temporal metric, the time since the object came into existence, without making reference to that object itself. So already it looks like we've got times that are in some sense dependent on the objects that persist through those times. And secondly, metrically relativizes in a way that this is proper times, which are dependent on an object's world line, which is in turn dependent on the behavior of the object, vis-a-vis its trajectory, its location, its relative motion. So it seems like there are two senses in which times are dependent in a way on the objects that persist through them. And in the second sense, it seems like the times are dependent on what the object actually does. So it kind of seems like my updated relationalist is getting closer to temporary intrinsics, because metric B takes the sting out of the problem somewhat. Because the relationalist is no longer understood to be relativizing to times that are completely independent of the objects that persist through those times. Instead, they seem to be importantly correlated with those times. So the relationalist, my updated relationalist, seems to be relativizing in a way that gets them closer to temporary intrinsics. But unfortunately, it doesn't get them all the way there. And that's because, as I said, metric B uses proper times. Now, proper times are a little bit of a double-edged sword in this case, because the relationalist is still relativizing to times that are, in some sense, independent of the objects that this is proven. And this is because of this proper time situation, because we understand proper times to be dependent on a world line, and this becomes problematic when we consider or when we distinguish between an object and its world line, because it seems like metric B is intrinsically instantiated by the world line, or fundamental to the world line, perhaps would be a better way of phrasing it, but not fundamental to the object that occupies that world line. So this means that what's happening when the relationalist relativizes to the proper times of metric B is analogous to what's happening when the relationalist relativizes to the absolute times of metric A. In both cases, they're relativizing to features that are at least in some sense independent of the object that instantiates the relativized properties. So in conclusion, the updated relationalist is also unable to deliver temporary intrinsics, just like the original relationalist. It's just slightly different because in the updated relationalist case, they seem to generate temporary properties that are sometimes intrinsic to the region's space-time that the object occupies. Now, a solution immediately presents itself. And that's simply to identify an object with the region of space-time that it occupies. And there's some support for this view. For example, Mark Gray says that the results of special relativity indicate that a physical system, by which he means an object only construed, simply is its world line. This would block premise 4, because the proper times associated with the world line do seem to just be fundamental features of that world line, given that world lines are just of space and temporal points. So the relationalist who identifies an object with the region of space-time that it occupies essentially cashes out relativization as a relation between an object and itself. This means that all of that object's temporary intrinsics would retain their status as such, because the relationalist doesn't understand themselves to be making reference to anything external to the object in order to explain those properties. However, the relationalist might be reluctant to identify an object with the region of space-time that it occupies. And that's because it might reasonably be objective that modal properties distinguish objects and the regions of space-time that they occupy. And so by Leibniz's law are distinct. So for example, we could say something like, the region that an object occupies would have existed even if the object hadn't. Now, the relationalist might not agree, and they could cite Alan Gibbard, David Lewis, and Harold Luhmann, all of whom construct modal approaches that imply that modal properties aren't the kind of properties that count when we are assessing identity claims. It's beyond the scope of this talk to give a full assessment of each of these approaches, but for now, I will say that I personally don't find any of these particularly compelling. So I will leave this option open on the table for the relationalist who is attracted by this analysis of broken statements. But presently, I think we should move on. And what I'd like to move on to is the compromise, what I like to think of as compromise. And to effect this compromise, I'm going to borrow two terms from Doug Herrington. He distinguishes between relative intrinsic properties and absolute intrinsic properties, where relative intrinsic properties are intrinsic properties that are fully grounded on extrinsic properties, whereas absolute intrinsic properties are not really grounded on extrinsic properties. So the relationalist who relativizes to proper times will sometimes, not always, create properties that are intrinsic to a region of space-time. It is those properties that would be the relative intrinsic properties, because they're fully grounded on an object's location in space-time. I think this establishes some distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic temporary properties. However, I don't think that this represents progress for the relationalist, given that I think using this was always open to them, even for the original relationalist who was relativizing to absolute times. So again, I think we should push on. And what I really think that the relationalist should do is to adopt my third solution and to claim that objects intrinsically instantiate metric B. And this will require a fairly specific conception of space-time, whereby times are fundamental to objects and not to the regions of space-time that they occupy. So I think the best bet for my relationalist is to adopt a dynamical view of space-time and reject a geometrical view of space-time. So geometrical views, they hold that the structure of space-time grounds the law-like behavior of objects, whereas proponents of the dynamical view hold that this gets the direction of explanation completely wrong, and that space-time can only be said to have the structural features that it has because objects behave in the law-like manner in which they do. And I think that this dynamical view implies two things. Or it implies that processes ground two things. So I think the first falls out of the view that processes ground the properties of space-time, because space-time can only be said to have properties like spatial and temporal extension, because the objects that occupy the space-time have temporal and spatial extension. So space-time only derivatively is four-dimensional. Which means that spatial, and more importantly for this talk, temporal extension are fundamental properties of the objects. But what I'd like to submit is that the dynamical view of spacetime implies that processes also ground what I'd like to call an object's intrinsic times. So this is the amount of time that has elapsed according to an object as given by the dynamical processes that constitute change for that object. This implies that an object intrinsically instantiates metric B, because we don't need to make reference to an object's worldline in order to make sense. Proponents of the dynamical view, and although you have to believe I'm wrong about this, but my understanding is that the main proponents of the dynamical view focusing on a fairly small range of processes, but it strikes me that my relationalist can be fairly liberal about the processes they use to ground their notion of intrinsically instantiated temporal passage. So I've chosen to represent thermodynamic processes on the slide here. I've got a bit of glass flowing. And that's because thermodynamic asymmetry plausibly gives us quite a neat way of constructing temporal passage. However, as I said, my relationalist can probably appeal to as wide a range of processes that they're prepared to tolerate. So I'm thinking about gravitationally mediated movements, chemical reactions, life processes like aging, maybe psychological processes if they want to get real wild with it. But yeah, as Wayne Marvel says, space-time symmetries will always coincide with canonical symmetries, so my relationalist can help themselves to the same amount of time as expressed by the proper times, but without having to make reference to a worldline. So my relationalist will see all objects kind of like non-ideal clocks that measure the amount of time that passes in virtue of undergoing dynamic change. So my relationalist will see change as more basic than time, which reverses the more sort of established view, which sees time as more basic than change, which kind of turns the problem of change on its head somewhat. Because as it's currently stated, it sort of implicitly asks us to explain what changes in terms of difference over time. But my relationalist will explain time in terms of change. So, to summarize, we have this established problem which accuses relationalism of being unable to deliver temporary intrinsics. I offered an update to this problem, which I argue was less of a concern for the relationalist, but it still ultimately implies that all of the relationalist's temporary properties are extrinsic because they're partly grounded by regions of space-time. We saw that there was an easy way out for the relationalist who was willing to identify objects with the regions of space-time that they occupy. But I didn't go for this view on account of the modal properties that distinguish objects in these space-time regions. We briefly considered a compromise whereby we sort of equivocated on the nature of intrinsic by introducing these relative intrinsic properties. However, given that this option seemed to be to the relationalist before the update, we decided to push on. So I think that the best solution for my relationalist is to endorse this dynamical view of space-time and stipulate that objects posit intrinsically instantiated chemical passage as sort of grounded by the dynamic processes that they undergo. And this provides support for the emerging view that change is ontologically prior to time. So, in conclusion, I think that the best form of relationalism understands temporary intrinsics to be relations between the object that instantiates them and their intrinsic times as sort of grounded by the dynamic processes they undergo. And that, my friends, is how I think the problem of temporary intrinsics is best solved. Thank you so much for listening. My email address is on the slide. I'd be delighted to write me if you wanted to send me an email. And thank you for the organisers for having me.
Okay, so so I end for question, finger for follow-ups.
Thanks for that. So yeah, there's lots in there that I agree with. Change prior to time. Yeah, already own that T-shirt. One of the things that I think about this is so the relationship between processes and endurance is an interesting one because of course once we've gone as far as you've gone, why not keep going? Why not get rid of endurance and become a process philosopher? Certainly, I know process philosophers who want to press me on that. And why, if we're having change prior to time, do we not think the problem's dissolved from the very start? Because if we're really taking change seriously, we don't have the tomato at 2 times. We've got the tomato now, and the tomato as it used to be, and they don't need to be. They don't need to have the same properties because we've only got one tomato, the current one, and it changes and it's allowed to. So the thought is by the time that you brought in sort of processes playing the kind of role you're in, why do you think we still need endurance at the end of this and need to respond to the kind of Lewisian, very static version of the problem?
Yeah, so I'm actually not an endurantist, so I'm actually more of a Lewisian. So I'm not sure if I'll be answering in the right sort of way, but I think that even if the kind of if my relationalist sort of understands change to be more basic than time, they still sort of need an answer for the Lewisian and sort of story. Maybe that's not a very satisfying answer. I think if I was an endurantist, I could give them more impassioned answer on their behalf.
The answer would be good than impassioned.
Oh, good.
Okay, so yeah, next question. You.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so thanks very much for the very interesting thought-provoking talk. I just admit I don't know a lot about the view that changes prior to time. So maybe my question is just to really to help me learn more about it. So maybe consider a case where I'm sure this has been discussed before, but two possible worlds both have object A and object B and no other object. A goes into existence, then goes out of existence. Then later B comes into existence, then goes out of existence. But in one possible world, say B comes into existence right after A goes out of existence. In the other one, it's like 1,000 years later or something. How is like the view we're considering explain something like that? Is it none of the ways I think of? Well, I don't know. How do people say?
I think multi-mix is there. I think that's a that. But this idea of having time in a changeless universe or region of space-time seems to be different. And what my relationalist will do when it comes to this with this one is simply to run away, because all my relationalist needs to do is to explain temporary intrinsics. Now, this means that they will have to, at least in my view, adopt this notion of intrinsically instantiated temporal passage. But they can also adopt other notions of time that give them time in a changeless spatio-temporal region or spatio-temporal or universe rather. I guess my relationalist is really limited. It just needs to do what I kind of have said it does, and it kind of strikes me that they're free to do whatever they want elsewhere, because when we've got these timeless universes or timeless regions of space-time, there are no temporary intrinsics to explain. So I guess they can pull back on whatever they thought time was before. Maybe that's
well, yeah, but maybe talk more about it later. Yeah, I don't have this.
If you want to follow up, yeah, I mean, I think we have time.
Well, yeah, I guess I was just okay. I was the idea that there are you could add to the theory that maybe there's another notion of time that explains that. I guess I would just wonder exactly how that would work. So if there is a sort of another notion of time, then you might want to know how does that notion map on to the other one. So like, can you, in this other notion of time, can you specify what time it is? And then does the question of, is the tomato green or red at that time appealing to the other notion? Does that still apply? Is there a way to address that? Or maybe this just isn't an issue.
No, I really did think about this because it does sound like quite messy, I suppose. I suppose another thing that they could do is kind of just make the object bigger. So, okay, we've got tomatoes appearing in universe A and universe B, and they're being for a little bit of time, or an instant, say, and when they appear, it's thousands of years apart from each other. You just make the object bigger and make the object the universe, and as if the universe has an intrinsic time. Maybe that, something a little bit like that, plausibly could work, but I do need to think more about this, and if it sucks, then apologies, I think it might be.
Thank you.
Yeah, there were two questions in the back, I think. Like also in the front from you, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's related to the first question. I'm also kind of curious about how your view ended up, whether it ends up more on the indurantist side or the perdurantist side. Because you set up as your view as presuming that we do not need temporal parts to account for temporary intrinsics. But the resulting view sounds a lot like what Lewis had said or would have said. Yeah.
I think this is a danger of being scripturalist. Can you tell me more about why this sounds more Lewisian than insurance?
Yeah, well, I think, well, Lewis, of course, he explicitly say that there are temporal parts, but of course, you do not have to endorse that. But say like a four-dimensionalist or predurantist or whatever would say that, well, it's these temporal sizes of the tomato is just like spatial parts of the tomato. And he ends up saying something like, well, this the tomato is red at this portion of it, and it's green at that portion of it. Well, that's more vague than some explicit commitment to temporal parts. But what you end up saying is also similar, like saying, well, some portion of it has this property, but another portion has different properties.
Oh, I don't think I'm trying to say that we're portioning up to the tomato at all. I'm just saying that it's intrinsically instantiating its own time to be relativized to. But I think relationalism is the most coherent-y version of intuitism, right? Because it's four-dimensional. So it kind of accepts that objects have temporal extension as well as a spatial extension. So I think it's going to sound a little bit pejorative anyway, given this commitment to four-dimensionalism. But I think as long as we don't portion up the tomato or the objects in general into temporal parts, it's still endurantism. But I do appreciate that I may have sort of slipped in my own perseverance and feelings and biases.
You in the black short, you have a question?
Yeah, I was also wondering about the proposal to understand change as being somewhat prior to time. First of all, I'm having trouble making sense of it, because if you think about what change even is, you tend to spell it out in terms of time. Something is one way one time, and another way another time. Second of all, that may be my fault. I don't quite see what motivates this proposal. Is it not just an add-on to your view that you're not really committed to? That's at least my impression, the impression I had. That it's like an add-on. I mean, if I understand you correctly, your view is basically a big part of it anyway, is that there's this intrinsic time that we should relativize things. And why cannot this intrinsic time just be ticking along without any change going on? So where does this come from? That we have to understand time in terms of change.
I agree that it's really difficult to conceptualize change psychologically prior to time. After that panel question and this idea of intrinsic time without change. I suppose I don't have a particularly good answer to that, other than that it's not what I need to do for my just current very, very specific purposes, which is to make sense of how relationalists can relativize in a way that doesn't make their temporary properties extrinsic, because when an object isn't changing, it doesn't have any temporary properties that need to be relativized. Again, maybe I'm very satisfied.
Okay. So I want to come back to the problem modality. And it might, and I wonder what you think of. Okay, so you were Lewis. So Lewis's definition of intrinsic properties is those are the properties that are all the properties that are shared by duplicates. Now notice that I always felt that this was a bit of a cheat for Lewis, because what that gives him is that modal properties are also intrinsic. Because basically, even though they're relational, because especially as a modal realist, it's about what it's basically representation relations. That's a possible world. Now you can be as axis, so that's possible. But if you took that definition on board, seems to me that you might be able to get your modality just the way that you want in the reductionist objective. So I wanted to encourage you to think about this.
Oh, I would consider myself encouraged. I really like that. Thank you. Yeah, I thought, for what it's worth, I've always thought of the duplicates definition as a bit of a cop out too. And then I started delving into the literature on intrinsic definitions. And no, I don't think it's all about. I think it's the only thing that makes sense.
I think I really think that's why Lewis defends that. I mean, it's got some intuitive connections to the Kim definition, the Java stuff, but like, I think he really wanted to bring in modality, and that's why he did it.
Oh, I see.
So, he doesn't say that anywhere, but I think that's
Really?
I'm like 95%.
Thank you.
I guess this is related to the second point here. So maybe just a clarification about this issue. Do you really need to reject the geometrical view space-time? I'm not sure. I think perhaps it's desirable not to put that dependent reason. And perhaps one thought might be that you might, since you wanted the spatio-temporal location spaces, you could take them as intrinsic without a need to the object is identical with the spatio-temporal location. If, for example, you make space-time regions to be somehow emergent on or dependent on the location taken as a previous product. So you might have a situation where being at T or being at TF, where time in the frame is the fundamental property, is intrinsic to the object. Still, the object is distinct from the spatio-temporal region, because the spatio-temporal region is defined in terms of the location relation, which is not relation; it's more of a locational property or locational property.
This is really helpful again. My modal intuitions are, I think my initial modal intuitions would have sort of bonked with that, but now I'm taking this test and thinking and analyzing in a slightly different way. Yeah, maybe, but this is really helpful.
Okay, there was, you first, I think. Oh, yeah.
I had a question, and it's also about the modal properties, and that perhaps they still may be problematic for you. And I think it depends on how much or how do you accommodate or deny what could be called temporal flexibility of things. So 3 dimensions. One is that tomato could have been exactly the same, but lived a little later. The tomato could also have a slightly longer or shorter life, while staying the same. So it could have, because it could have ended in red, but stayed red for longer. And then it could also have had a different kind of it could have lived at a different time, or at the same time longer or less long, or being in a phase for a longer or shorter time. And I think at least one of these 3 you will probably want to accommodate. But then I guess you do get modal properties problems, because it could have had that redness for a longer time.
No, I completely agree. I don't think I necessarily want to accommodate the equilibrium. I think I'm happy with my understanding of it could have lived in a different time, because I sort of want to relativize in a way that makes a tomato that is exactly the same was read in 1860 as a tomato that instantiated read in the 90s. I want them to be instantiated in exactly the same property, but as well as in exactly the same way. If if the amount of time that it is taking them to instantiate exactly that shade of red is the same, I feel like that's really important to my design view. So it sort of doesn't matter that they're temporally dissipated or that they, so one tomato could have been exactly that shade of red, but in a different century, in another possible world. I think I'm fine with that, but this is fine that the tomato could have been red for a longer time. I certainly want to relate, and
yeah, if it's quick, yeah.
Isn't it like, wouldn't you just solve using counterpart theory? I mean, these are like familiar problems.
okay. Yeah, okay.
If you're gonna go that way, just go counterpart theory.
It's in less sure.
Okay, so you in the blue short, yeah. If I can ask you to be quick, because we have 10 minutes and 2 other questions. Yeah.
Thank you. So, the problem of temporary intrinsics, when we focus a bit on the intrinsic, but I wonder if the temporary is about ones. So, in the first page that we get this presentation, just rejects relationalism because it's incredible that you can have intrinsic property be a disguised relation. He knows what they are, they're intrinsic properties. And it seems like there's a second objection you could have made, which is, and of course, relationist endurantism commits you to an eternally unchanging intrinsic nature if you can recover the intrinsicality of the relations. Because the enduring thing, the thing that's one and the same through time, just have all these relations to times is fixed and unchanging. So if we're solving the problem of temporary intrinsics, we get something like the intrinsicality of properties, don't we still also need to have the thing be genuinely temporary, i.e. changing?
Oh, so the whole tomato is basically red at some time, so the whole tomato is intrinsically red at some later time. So it's intrinsically red even when it's intrinsically green.
Yeah, the first point in your diagram, it stands in the redness relation and the orangeness relation and the yellowness relation and the greenness relation. You have all of those.
All of those at the same time, yeah.
An unchanging nature.
Yes, with respect to different times, yeah. Yeah, and I think that this is kind of okay because, like I'm larger than my houseplant, but smaller than my house. And I can bear both of those relations at the same time without comparison and contradictions. So yeah, it could be intrinsically green to intrinsic time 1, could be intrinsic to be yellow to intrinsic time 2. I know that these look like they might be contradictory, but with respect to different objects. My houseplant.
Okay, so I'm wondering whether, on your view, an object is identified as a process.
I don't think I'm going that far yet. No, I think it just intrinsically. It's process. I think they're like sort of fundamental to the object. Otherwise, you can't get intrinsic. I don't think. So I don't think I'm identifying an object with a process yet.
Okay. So in what
Also, yeah.
in what sense an object can instantiate a process?
So maybe this is where it starts to sound a little bit more worm theoretic than intuitive, because I'm taking the process as imperative rather than the properties that kind of make up the process that's primitive, or it's kind of ontologically private. But yeah, I'm sort of taking a kind of temporally distributional property, as in, you know, kind of like cross-time property.
Okay, so my real worry is this: if you identify an object with a process, then it really depends on what kind of ontology of process you have, and that would determine whether your view, how far your view is distinct from productivism. If you know, if a process is just a series of events interconnected in a certain way, so it really looks like a productivism.
I see. Thank you. Just think about how I can see this.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for this. It's just I have a remark and a question to go together. On the one hand, I'm wondering if you are also have in mind or trying to combine, on the one hand, what you have characterized as properties, which I understand completely, I mean, as a property of the thing. And on the other hand, because this intrinsic time is not actually describable, and on the other hand, how we can finally describe, which joins also some other remarks, how we can describe as an observer this intrinsic time. So we must pass through change to finally find this time, and also finally to compare intrinsic times. I have the feeling that you try to reconcile on the one hand an observer and a comparison between things, because there I need time as regular norm, and on the other hand, which is the time that is an intrinsic property. And I'm wondering, so this is my question, what happens if, because okay, for the tomato it's rather explicit, but if we have a human being and there we have different changes that affect at the same time or at different intrinsic times, or how can we give an account of overlapping processes that actually, yes, that they are affecting the organism at the same time. So yeah. This is since we're talking about intrinsic times.
Yeah, I think we want to be able to make sense of the comparison that we want to make in scenarios like a twin scenario, right? So like where we've got like, where we kind of want to observe like two different what I'm calling intrinsic times. We still want to be able to say, well, like with respect to the travelling twin, the earthbound twin gets her first impulse early. And I think we can do that, but we just got to understand them as relational properties, because and they are, right? Like it's a relation between two twins. I don't think we want to say that I thought we were talking about speed, so I don't think we want to say that the travelling twin being younger than their twin is an intrinsic property of theirs. We want to say that it's a relational property. So we've got to bring in these kind of like multi-perspectival view here.
Yes, I understand.
Okay, so time is up. Let's thanks.